we usually don't do stories about authors, that have just come out and written a book. That's sort of not one of Dan's things to do. But Norm Ornstein and Thomas Mann actually have a history with Dan. Norm used to be on CBS all the time, and so it was a little bit like a reunion when they met. They sort of talked about old times and settled in. But the concern was they were writing this book about Congress, and they have been longtime followers of Congress. One works for a sort of more conservative think tank, the other works for a little bit more of a progressive one. And they had teamed up in the past to really sort of call Congress to account for all the misdoings they were doing. And they've been basically deemed as fair-minded, objective observers of Congress. Whether or not they're criticizing one side or the other, no one has ever accused them of bias. And this time around, they wrote this book called It's Even Worse Than It Looks, where they clearly laid blame on the very right-wing conservative Republican Party for creating a completely dysfunctional Congress. And they don't hold back. I mean, they really go after them. And interestingly enough, it's sort of made everyone shy away in terms of the media from interviewing them. So Dan, as we know, likes to talk about how the media has changed, how the press is no longer fiercely independent. We're all sort of bound with the big corporations owning, multiple stations, and everyone sort of has to think about where the paycheck's coming from, so no one wants to appear biased in any way. So if you have a controversial topic, you get someone on the right and you get someone on the left, and they just sort of meet in the middle and talk about, who's on what side, and then the actual reporters can kind of sit back and let the two of them duke it out, but they don't really have to inject themselves or seem like they're biased in any way. So what Norm Ornstein and Thomas Mann do is they look at the media and they say, you're just as much to blame for letting all of this go to hell, really, because you're not calling anyone to account. You're not bringing people like us on, because we appear that we have a bias now, because we're saying the Republican Party is causing this dysfunction in Congress, and you're afraid that if you bring us on your broadcast, you're going to seem like you have a liberal bias. And so everyone's shying away from that. And that sort of struck a chord with Dan, for sure. He feels that there is a lot of corporate influence in the media, and because of that, we've sort of lost our guts. We don't go after a story and really stick to it. We always look for the other side to even it out. And what the authors will argue is sometimes there is more than two sides to a story. There can be 5 sides to a story. And you know what? Someone can be right in a story, and you can come out and say, yeah, they've got a point, and maybe it's biased, but it makes a lot of sense, and this is what's happening. I mean, we're all sort of put as journalists into this situation where you feel like, I can't just listen to one guy tell me his side of the story. I've got to find someone to counter it. I have to find someone who doesn't agree with this person's opinion. And I think that's really healthy. But I think it's unhealthy when you're just doing it for the sake of appearing to be unbiased. If there's a legitimate reason, if there is a really strong argument for one thing and a strong opinion against the other, it makes sense to sort of have those debates. But if something is destructive or dysfunctional and you can point the finger at someone really clearly and show specific examples as to why that's happening, in the past, that would be the story. You weren't afraid to just come out and say, listen, I might get slammed for this, but I believe this is the story, and I'm going to let this be the story as it airs or as it's told. And I think now we all shy away from that. And that's what we have to struggle with, is to sort of, not get nervous about being accused of, you're liberal or you're conservative, or, I know what your political standpoint is because of the kind of story you do. That's what everyone's sort of afraid of. They all just want to appear independent. And the reality is there aren't that many independent news organizations out there at all.